My name's Tim Standish. I work at the Geoscience Research Institute, which is located in Loma Linda in Southern California. I'm currently at the Faith and Science conference in St. George, Utah, and one of the topics that I've talked about is the relationship between chimpanzees and human beings. Obviously, if you look at chimpanzees, they are more like humans than, let's say, bananas or worms or something like that. So it wouldn't be unexpected to find that there is some genetic similarity between humans and chimpanzees. But is it 1%? Is that how much difference there is between humans and chimpanzees? Or is the difference greater? And what would the Bible lead us to expect about something like that? I want to draw your attention to a couple of texts right here at the beginning of the Bible. I'm going to read Genesis 2:7. And this is talking about the creation of human beings. And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And man became a living being. So here we have the Lord God forming human beings and breathing the breath of life into them, and that's what makes them human. Some people look at this and they say, aha, look at how different the creation was of humans relative to other kinds of animals. But in reality, that's not what the Bible teaches. If you go down just a few verses from Genesis 2:7 to Genesis 2:19, we have an account of how the animals were made. Out of the ground the Lord God formed every beast of the field and every bird of the air and brought them to Adam. So the Lord God formed the animals also out of the ground, just as he formed humans out of the ground. But what about the breath of life? To figure out that, you actually have to go down a few more chapters to Genesis chapter 7. This is when all the animals were being brought onto the ark. And here in Genesis 7 verse 15 it says, and they, this is the animals, went into the ark to Noah 2 by 2 of all flesh in which is the breath of life. So what we see is that animals and humans were formed in a very similar way. They were formed by the Lord God out of the dust of the ground, and they have the breath of life. Same creator, same materials, same everything. So it shouldn't be surprising to discover that there are similarities between animals and human beings, or that human beings in fact are a special kind of animal. Now obviously humans were created in the image of God. Dogs were not, even though they're lovely in their own way. There is something very special about humans, but we are not physically different in some way from the other animals. So some similarity is what is expected. And yet most of us have seen references to the idea that human beings and chimpanzees have genomes that are 99% identical or only 1% different. Is that really the case? Actually, if you go into the peer-reviewed literature, what you find is not a lot of help for that particular issue. So or that particular claim. If you just start looking, you see lots of different numbers. I just have a list of some here from peer-reviewed articles, 99.4, 98.77. Well, that's close to 99% identical. But 98% identical, that's also a common number that you hear out there. However, when the chimpanzee genome was first published, and that was after the human genome had been published, when they compared the two published sequences, the similarity dropped to 96%, which still seems quite similar. There's another reference here to 95%. Currently, people are looking at how that chimpanzee genome was put together, and what they've noticed is two things. First of all, it was assumed that the chimpanzee genome would be very similar to the human genome. So what they did was they used the human genome as the scaffold onto which they put all of these little pieces of chimpanzee genome to sort of line them up and get the complete sequence. As it turns out, that appears to have introduced some bias. It made the chimpanzee genome look somewhat more like the human genome than it actually is. In addition to that, particularly the early sequencing that was done seems to have been subject to some kind of contamination. And the consequence of that is that the human component appears higher than it actually is. What does it mean? Talking about percentages of difference, what does that actually mean? Well, there are lots of very technical ways of getting into things. Percent really isn't a very good way of expressing similarity and difference between genomes, but it gives a general idea. In one sense, you can think about it like this. The human genome is approximately 3 billion bases long, and so is the chimpanzee genome. We'll come back to the length of the genomes in just a minute. So 3 billion, if you have 1% difference, that means that there are 30 million differences between the chimpanzee genome and the human genome, or 15 million differences that have to have accumulated since we shared a common ancestor, if in fact we did share a common ancestor. That's for 1% difference. 15 million differences have to have accumulated in what is supposed to have been about 6 million years. There's a major problem with that, and that is that human beings cannot produce enough babies to allow all of the individuals who didn't have these, who were not accumulating these 15 million changes, to be culled out of the population, to be selected out. Human women would need to be having something well over 100 babies each to have fixed 15 million differences in the human genome over the course of 6 million years. So that seems to be actually quite a problematic proposition. And of course, the difference isn't just 1%. It's at least several percents. In fact, recently I've seen estimates as much as approaching up to 30% difference between the human genome and the chimpanzee genome. Of course, there are lots of ways of doing statistics and lots of ways of representing these things. The bottom line is this: when it comes to expressing things in terms of a percentage, that's not all that meaningful. But when you do look at how the chromosomes are arranged in human beings versus those in chimpanzees, there are profound differences. When you look at the ends of the chromosomes on chimpanzees and human chromosomes, there are profound differences. When you look at where certain kinds of genetic recombination occur within the genomes of chimpanzees and human beings, you see profound differences. In other words, you see lots and lots of differences that are not expressed in terms of just a simple percentage. When it's all said and done, my opinion is that the case for common ancestry between human beings and chimpanzees is weak at best. I believe that there were separate origins for these two groups of organisms. I believe that's also consistent with the biblical view. There is something special and different about human beings. And as a consequence of that, this is one of many reasons why I, as a scientist, am very comfortable with the idea of the creation as it's expressed in the Bible. I particularly like the way the creation is expressed in the New Testament. I'll close with this text, Colossians 1:16. For by him all things were created that are in heaven and that are on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or principalities or powers, all things were created through him and for him. And that's why I worship the Creator God.